1 second. Welcome everybody to the fourth lesson of Outsmarting Antisemitism. Tonight's actually going to be the last lesson, and I honestly think there is a lot meat left on the bone of this course. We're going to have a lot to talk about. I think it's going to be a good discussion. And I think we'll all, myself included, have the opportunity to learn a lot about our own opinions, the Judaism's approach towards addressing anti-Semitism. Up to this point, we talked about the history of anti-Semitism, the roots of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism as it's guided towards Israel. But now, what do we actually do about anti-Semitism itself? When, for instance, the way we're going to frame it generally is when a public figure, let's say a politician, movie star, a celebrity, head of state, an influencer, as they say today on the internet, when an influencer says or does something anti-Semitic, what should our approach be? How do we respond? We're going to give at least one idea from what the Torah has to say. You might not necessarily agree with it, but I think it's an important ingredient for us to, so to speak, throw into the blender to think about before we react. And we're actually going to open today by giving a reference to a specific case, and that's how we're going to frame the conversation as we go forward. In the beginning of Israel's existence, the state of Israel's existence, particularly the 50s and the 60s, France, the country of France, was its main arms supplier. Israel did not have the capability of manufacturing its own weapons, so its main supplier of weaponry was France. Right before the outset of the Six-Day War in 67, so Israel had ordered and actually paid for 50 Mirage jets, top-of-the-line jets from France. But just before the outbreak of hostilities, right before the war actually started, so the president, who was at that time Charles de Gaulle, had the chutzpah, or gall, that was intentional, to place an embargo against the sale of any military equipment to either side of the conflict, right? So that's the way it was framed, that nobody who's going to be involved in this conflict in the Middle East is going to be getting French weaponry. In reality, this was only really directed towards Israel because the Arab nations, which included Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, they bought they were supplied actually by the Russians. So they didn't have to, they didn't have to rely on France. And most political observers at that time agreed that the reason France did this was they were trying to boost the relationships with the Arab nations of the Middle East. This was really, for many years, for decades, France did not have a good relationship with the Arab countries because they were occupying Algeria. So they couldn't come and say, let's do business with oil while they're busy occupying Algeria. But a couple of years before the Six-Day War, they finally left Algeria. So now they felt, what's better economically, to deal with this one tiny Jewish state of 4 million people, or with the 200 million Arabs that's around them? So they made a practical decision, right?
What does Pompey do?
Oh, so that's what Charles de Gaulle did. But it got even worse after the Six-Day War. Part of Israeli history that many people don't recognize is between the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, which was in 73. There was actually something known as the War of Attrition. The War of Attrition was Egypt basically just fighting literally a war of attrition against Israel. They had air raids. They sent actual raiders over the border, just harassing Israel, trying to drain its resources. So at this point, during the War of Attrition in 1970, so the president of France at the time was a man by the name of Georges Pompidou. I think that's how you pronounce it. Maybe yes, maybe no. So he announced that they're going to sell Mirage jets to Libya. Okay? And it was reported in the Times, which we're about to read, that they were going to sell 50 jets to Libya. Why can you sell to Libya? Because Libya wasn't involved in the war of attrition. Right? It wasn't one of the combatants. You had Israel versus Egypt and maybe Lebanon. But Libya, that's in North Africa, it's not involved. So what's the problem? Everyone knew that the Libyans didn't even have the pilots to fly 50 Mirage jets. They were not capable of taking order of 50 Mirage jets. It was going to end up, and everyone knew where it was going, right? So, Shalom, do me a favor, read text 1. Hi, Rochelle. Glad you could join us. We are on page 116. And Shalom, if you can do it loud so they can hear you.
Okay, sure. All right, Mirage jets to Libya. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting front. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict. Israel, the United Arab Republic,
which was what Egypt was called itself at the time, the United Arab Republic,
Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan mirages is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force, in its present state, could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country.
So this was actually a major issue for Israel. It sounds kind of minor that France doesn't want to sell its planes to you, but something that most of us probably don't realize, and I actually didn't really think about much before I learned about the Six-Day War in depth, is Israel had nowhere else to buy arms from. The American government did not sell arms to Israel at this point. Eisenhower refused to, and it took a lot of pressure till Kissinger and Nixon sold right before the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, right? So if they can't buy their plane, Sophia, there's more books on top of the Sidurim in the ladies section if you need one. So if Israel couldn't get its planes from France, this was a very big deal. And here all of a sudden, France is literally, right at this point, they were literally stacking the deck against Israel. They won't sell the planes to Israel, but to sell to Libya. And anyone who knew what was happening on the ground knew that those planes were not actually destined for Libya eventually.
And LBJ was our president at the time.
No, it was Nixon. This was in 70.
Oh, 70.
This was in 70. Yeah. So I would like for you could share with me what might be a good strategy for dealing with such a public figure, let's say like Pompidou, who is taking an unfavorable position towards the Jewish people, or in this case, the land of Israel, the state of Israel. What would be a good strategy to take towards that person? You could give me some do's or don'ts. If just feel free to throw them out.
I would write. This is what I wrote down. I would write letters to the politicians.
Okay.
That's what I did as a kid, as a teenager. I did write letters to politicians. You can inform your congregation to build some solidarity and representation. Maybe in Washington, go there. You can organize a movement to upset or start a petition with names. You could threaten violence.
I was about to say, I'm sure that all these sound a little tame for your taste, and then you throw that one out.
You could stalk their private residences.
So Rochelle throws out from on the chat to make a rally, things like that nature, political activism, whatever it might be.
Right.
So as we've done this entire course, and as we continue to do whenever we sit down at one of these courses, one of these classes, we turn to the Torah for some guidance. What does the Torah have to teach us in such a scenario? And we're actually going to turn to a story which we just read this past Shabbos, 2 days ago. The story of Jacob when he finally confronts his brother Esau. So just to put the story into context, before we actually dive into it, Yaakov had been away from home for over 30 years. 30 years prior, he had taken the blessings from Esau. Esau swore to destroy his brother. Yaakov flees. He builds himself a family. He gets himself financially secure. He finally decides, and he's encouraged by God to return to Israel. But as he's about to return back to Israel to reunite with his parents, he sends spies ahead of him, malachim. He sends spies out ahead of him, and they inform him that your brother Esau is not that excited to see you. And in fact, he's marching towards you with a band of 400 men. Yaakov's family, his entire entourage was maybe 30, 40 people. Esau was coming with 400 people, and Yaakov took this to mean that Esau still bore that grudge, and it's not going to be good. So the Torah tells us how Yaakov prepared for this encounter. And the Talmud the Medrash encapsulates it very easily for us to understand. In text 2, this is from the Medrash on page 119. Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and an armed struggle. So, like we learned in lesson 1, that whenever we're facing a situation, we have to make what we called a kind of a veil, a keli, a vessel for God's blessings to come into, correct? But where's the actual safety come from? The security comes from Hashem, from God. So the first thing Jacob does is pray, right? But what's the second thing he does? He prepares a gift. He sends a gift to Esau. What did the gift comprise of? The Torah actually lists it. It was upwards of 500 animals. That was the currency back then in the middle, right? For a nomadic people. He sent him, this was a good bribe. He sent him sheep. He sent him goats. He sent him camel. He sent him cows. He sent him, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, he sent him horses or not. He sent the livestock, and it was over 500 animals. It was a big deal. And the Torah actually describes how Yaakov sent each species, each flock on its own, and told them to give space so the prize will look bigger. The bribe will look bigger, right? And whenever any of them come and they approach Esau's going to be wondering where all these animals are going. Say, oh, your dear brother Yaakov hopes that sends his best wishes. And this was all in preparation for him meeting Esau the next morning. So Yaakov, you can imagine, and this is actually something that Rashi intimates in his commentary, Yaakov was less than thrilled to send all these gifts to Esau. Is it fair? No, think about it. Is it fair that he should have to spend a ludicrous amount of money? Think what 500 animals would have cost Yaakov. He has to spend a ludicrous amount of money because this guy wants to kill him. It's unjustifiable. And I'm being extorted. It's not really fair, right? But, and he might have even bothered him, you could think. So another person could have bothered him. This would have been seen as a sign of weakness. But Yaakov did engage in this effort, and he also prepared for war only as a last resort. Yaakov did not want to have to battle. He was ready to battle, but he did not want to do this. And he did not see this as a sign of weakness, as a sign of an inferiority complex. Yaakov was confident in the fact that Hashem would protect him. But he still felt, that it's best, before I'm ready to escalate it to war, to outright warfare, diplomacy has its place. And while it might be inconvenient for me, so to speak, and somebody else might misconstrue it, I am confident in my position, and I feel that diplomacy is the best option. And as it turned out, Yaakov's scheme was actually effective. As the Torah tells us, let's look in text 3, Esau ran towards Jacob, this is the next day, and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept. The next morning, they finally see each other after several decades. And even though Esau had been harboring so much animosity towards Yaakov for decades, he had that hatred burning within him. Still, when they finally met each other, Esau was appeased, and they kissed, and they wept.
Do you think that's because he got the animals, or he would have been that way without the offering of the animals?
The way the Torah lays it out, the narrative, first he sends the gifts, and then the next day he comes and he bows, and he has his children bow, and he's mollifying him, so to speak. Mm-hmm. He's petitioning him. Mm-hmm. He's engaging in diplomacy, and immediately afterwards they kiss. It seemed to have this effect, correct? And here's a question. Did this elaborate effort convert Esau into being a chummy brother? Was the relationship repaired? Did they become allies moving forward? Actually not. We find that later on, they completely diverged. For the rest of their lives, they had nothing to do with each other, actually. And Esau was belligerent towards Yaakov and his children, even after Yaakov's death. But in fact, actually, our sages say that Esau might not have been sincere in the moment when he was kissing Jacob. If you look inside a Torah, everyone here seen an original Torah scroll, right? Or what was the terminology? Or a copy. I don't know. What was the word I'm trying to look? But in an original Sefer Torah, in an authentic Sefer Torah, facsimile, but I was trying to look for a more, a real Torah has no punctuation marks whatsoever, right? Yeah. That's why it's so complicated. It has none of the notes, it has none of the punctuation marks, it doesn't even have the vowels, right? The Hebrew vowels are made with dots. There's no dots in the Torah. There happen to be about fewer than a dozen words in the Torah that have dots on top of the words. Dots on top of the words. And the way the rabbis interpret this throughout the ages is that the Torah is trying to tell you that this word has its simple meaning, but there's something more here, something more to the narrative. So if you look inside a Torah, you might, let's see if we can get it up here on the screen. If you look inside an actual Torah, so the word for and he kissed him is vayishakehu.
The word for what?
For and he kissed him.
And he kissed him.
They made it's too small. You'd have to. It's a shame. Should have made a separate slide. The word in Hebrew for and he kissed him, meaning that Esau kissed Yaakov, is vayishakehu. On top of the word vayishakehu are a series of dots. Every letter has a dot on top of it. So generally, it's generally understood when you have dots on top of a Torah word, it signalizes a minimizing of sorts. So what does it mean in our instance that Antichistum is meant to be minimized in its interpretation? So this might come to as a shock to you, but there's a disagreement in the Talmud as to what exactly this means, right? Lo and behold, the sages have more than one opinion, right? Let's look in text 4, page 120. Page 120, text 4. The Torah features dots over the words, quote, and he kissed him. This is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. So one opinion in the Talmud is that when Esau was still had carried hatred in his heart towards Yaakov in this moment. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, it is an established fact that Esau hates Yaakov. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time, and it kissed him wholeheartedly. So we have two opinions here as to what exactly happened when Esau kissed Jacob. On the one hand, one opinion is that he never really got over it, and he didn't really mean it at the time. And the other opinion is that even though Esau still bore his resentment towards Yaakov, in that very moment, he was overwhelmed with compassion and love towards his brother. So in that moment, he might have been sincere. But either way, according to both opinions, did Yaakov get what he needed out of this interaction?
Yes.
Yeah. He hugged his brother. He kissed his brother. His brother let him continue on his journey towards his reunification with his parents to go back to the land of Israel. So Jacob got what he needed from this interaction. Maybe it didn't work to turn Esau into a longtime ally, which probably would have been nice. So after all, it's his twin brother, and he turned out to be a mighty warrior, et cetera, et cetera. But it didn't work out that way. But what Jacob needed out of this one interaction, he got. So throughout history, Judaism, especially Jews who study the Torah, we always have take the narratives of the Torah as well as lessons to our lives. Because the Torah, while the stories in Torah are our history, we believe it's our history, but the Torah is not a history book. And there are many, many stories in the Torah that don't have lots of details. And there are many stories that we have from the Medrash and our sages that are not even mentioned in the Torah. So whenever the Torah mentions a story, it must mean that there's some sort of a lesson for us to take from it. It's supposed to be a guide to our life. The word Torah, it comes from the word hora'ah, which means a lesson. So every story is a lesson. And Nachmanides tells us, we are in text 5 on page 121, that throughout the ages, whenever the Jewish people faced a scenario where they had to figure out how to deal with an adversary, they turned to this specific story of Jacob dealing with his twin brother Esau. The Medrash relates, we're reading text 5 on page 121, the Medrash relates that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. Rabbi Yanai lived during the era post the Second Temple, after the destruction of the Second Temple. At that time, Israel was still under Roman occupation. And he was involved in community affairs, and he occasionally had to go and deal with the Roman government. So every time before he went and dealt with the Roman government, he would sit down and study this chapter to try to internalize what it says and the lessons it has towards how it would apply in his interaction with the Roman government. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach, to adopt it in actual practice. So there are many lessons that Rabbi Yanai could have learned from this interaction between Yaakov and Esau. But one central idea that Jews throughout the ages gleaned from this story was that they could and should wield influence over the Esavs of their generation to gain concessions from them that might be beneficial towards Jews. What I mean by that is that a problematic Gentile, an adversary, is not necessarily somebody who has to be fought with or somebody who you have to cut off all ties with. To the contrary, the Torah looks at it that if the Jews played their cards right in the situation, they might be able to get certain things from the government that they need. Yes, Yaakov was prepared to fight in the scenario, right? Yaakov prepared for war. But he understood that first, it's beneficial to try diplomacy, right? Even if the guy doesn't agree with you politically, even if the guy actually outwardly expresses anti-Semitic or hateful attitudes, that still doesn't mean they can't be worked with. Esau was the anti-Semite. And Yaakov was able to find common ground, so to speak, and get what he needed from Esau. And there's actually many examples from this. One example is a story from the very same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We just mentioned that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, that it's an established fact that Esau hates Yaakov. And when he said that, he didn't just mean the biblical Esau and the biblical Yaakov. He meant the Esau and the Yaakov of his time, which was what? The Roman government and the Jewish people. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had ample reason to believe that the Roman government hated the Jewish people. He lived through the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Jewish population was decimated by the Roman government. and the terrible persecution that Hadrian imposed on the Jewish people. His own teacher, Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, was actually torn limb from limb by the Romans. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of his primary students. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself was threatened with a death sentence and had to flee for 13 years. So he knew well and good that the Romans were not big fans of the Jewish people. And he was the one who said that it's established fact that Esav, Rome, hates Yaakov, the Jewish people of the time. But yet we have a story that, text 6, there's a story we're going to read right now, that there was a situation where the Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. This was a time of intermittent Roman persecution against Jewish practice. Like I think we mentioned that last week, they outlawed for a period of a few years the reading of the Torah in public on Shabbos, right? So here there was a proposition made. They were debating it in the Senate, however the process was back then. How they got a bill made into law in the Roman Senate, I can't tell you. But somebody suggested that they outlaw 3 major Jewish practices: Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity, going to the mikveh. So the Medrash, it's actually only hinted to in the ellipses, so I'll tell you what happens in the interim. So the Medrash tells us that there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Reuven, and he said he went ahead and infiltrated the Roman government, actually. He grew out his hair in the Roman style. He took off his, however Jews were dressing then. He was an imposter. And he went into the Roman government, and he started talking to them. And he said, do you want your enemies to be wealthy? And he said, no. He said, well, if you allow them not to work 1 day a week, they're not going to be industrious. They're not going to make so much money. So why would you outlaw Shabbat? Right? Let them keep Shabbat. Let them not make money. Do you want your enemies to be fruitful? They said, no. Obviously, we want fewer enemies. So he said, well, circumcision and family purity, in your argument, what do? They minimize procreation. So they said, okay, great. So they canceled the decree, right? In the interim, they actually discovered that he was an imposter. So they got rid of that, and they rewrote the decree. So then the Talmud tells us that the Medrash tells us the rabbis asked themselves, who should we send to Rome? So the Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit a annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, for he is experienced in miracles. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the very same person who said, the very same person who said it, it's an established fact that Rome hates Jews. Shimon ben Yochai, who himself suffered under the Roman government, he was appointed to go consult with lobby the Roman government. And the Medrash, the story ends that he shows up in Rome, and when he shows up in Rome, the emperor's daughter was suffering some sort of episode, whether it was either an epileptic seizure or she was possessed by something. Rabbi Shimon Yochai shows up, and this is what happens: she's possessed, or she has a seizure, and he cures her. He cures the emperor's daughter. The emperor says, "Take any boon that you want." Rabbi Shimon Yochai asks for that decree, and he tears it up. That's what he got, right? So again, this is the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that argued that it's an established fact that Rome hates Israel. And we would understand if he would refuse to deal with Rome or write off his relationship with them. After all, what use could there be to go deal with Rome? And yet he went, because Yaakov's experience taught him that it's not a contradiction. I can believe that in your heart you don't like me, but at the same time I can still work with you, right? Or like Yaakov and Esav, I might even get a kiss from you, even if that kiss is not wholehearted. But right now, can I meet my goals through having a relationship with you, through entreating, through lobbying, to use a modern terminology, with you? And this model actually was continued to be used by European Jews for hundreds of years. In Europe, there were always some people known as shtadlanim, which comes from the Hebrew word hishtadlut, which means to work in community affairs. Pejoratively, they were known as court Jews. Court Jews. Every major monarchy in Europe, at least, had a court Jew, right? Oftentimes, these were wealthy Jews who had access to money, and they would give loans to the government, whatever it was. But there were many Jews who became what we call shtadlanim, or court Jews, and advocated on behalf of themselves, their community, or even the Jewish people overall. If you go to figure 4.1 on page 123, they just list a smattering of some of those shtadlanim, these court Jews, throughout. This is, I think, basically only in Bavaria or the Holy Roman Empire, right? So one of the most famous and actually successful shtadlanim was a man by the name of Yosele or Joseph of Rosheim. Joseph of Rosheim. He lived in the 15th century, and he advocated on behalf of the Jews in the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. I once heard the Holy Roman Empire wasn't that holy, it wasn't that Roman, it also wasn't much of an empire, right? But Maximilian I, and later also even his grandson, Charles V. And these two rulers actually were not Jew lovers. In fact, Charles V had very interesting parentage, his heritage. He was a grandson of King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Who infamously expelled all the Jews from Spain. They also in 1492, and they influenced Portugal to expel all their Jews about a decade later. And they started they upped the ante of the Inquisition. So this Yossele knew that this Charles V was not a huge fan of the Jews, and Maximilian was not a huge fan of the Jews. But he visited their courts on many, many, many occasions, and managed to procure from them different favors or boons for the Jews of his community, and even from other communities. And he wrote a memoir, and the memoir is it's a good read. It's a fascinating read. It's a worthwhile. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry. There's just someone trying to join the meeting. Here we go. And let's just take one example from this man's memoirs, which actually speaks to a lot about who he was, how he spent his time, and what his world outlook was. Again, this is Yossele Rosheim, who was a Stadlin, or an advocate for the Jewish people in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th and early 16th centuries. In 1531, the denouncers once again hounded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, which is about 4 months. He spent a lot of time there, 3 months, I'm sorry, pursuing the interest of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands, from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had a free time and was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path. So this actually tells us a lot about who he was as a person and how he spent his time. So it's interesting. First of all, he's constantly talking about Hashem's help and God willing, and with God's assistance. So he was obviously a very devout Jew. And he spent a lot of time dealing with people who harbored much ill will towards the Jews of his land and other lands as well. And another thing that's interesting, he said he was there for 4 months. He was confined in his room a lot. My assumption is because in those lands, he says Holland and Belgium, Jews were not allowed to live there permanently. So it probably was not a good idea for a religious-looking Jew to be wandering the streets of Belgium and Holland. So he spent his time in his own chambers. And what did he do with that free time? He wrote a book of Jewish ethics. We actually don't have that book. It is referenced by contemporaries of his, but we don't have that book, sadly. But our point is, what's our point over here? That this Yossele, this Joseph, he did not think that the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella was a great lover of Jews. And he did not think that he's going to change his mind about his attitude toward Jews either. In fact, actually, this Charles V was technically, because he was uniting both dynasties, he was technically the ruler of Spain at that time. What was Spain doing at that time? The Jews were expelled, but they were also they were prosecuting the Inquisition against Jews, and they were burning suspected Jews at auto de fe at that time. So it was well established this man did not love the Jewish people. But still, he felt that it was a worthwhile endeavor to lobby him and to build a dialogue with this man. And in fact, he was very successful. And he convinced him that it was worthwhile not to expel the Jews from the Holy Roman Empire, for example, in one instance at least. To be sure, I want to make it very clear, this model doesn't always work.
No.
Does not always work. Actually, on figure 4.2, there's a painting. It was by, I believe, a Spanish artist, and it depicts a man known as the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel, you might have heard of him before. His name was Don Isaac Abarbanel, and he lived in Spain, but right before 1492. And he was a very influential man. He was very wealthy. He was well respected in scientific circles as well. And he had a position in the courts and had a very good relationship with the king, actually. He had a good relationship with the king. So after this edict, the edict of expulsion was announced, he spent a lot of time trying to convince the king to rescind this decree. And he offered him a ridiculous amount of money, actually, of his own money to rescind the decree. And according to legend, this is not confirmed by Jewish sources, but according to non-Jewish legend, as he's sitting and having this debate, he's trying to convince, while the Abarbanel, was trying to convince the king, Ferdinand, to change his mind, the infamous inquisitor, what was his first name? Thomas de Torquemada, burst into the door and he says, Judas sold him, meaning sold him for 30 silver pieces. Are you going to do the same now? And once that happened, he was very influential in course, Torquemada, and Isaac Barbanel recognized that it's over. So if you look at this painting, which is on page 126, you see a man with a yarmulke pleading with the king and the queen, and that's Torquemada actually gesticulating wildly. You see in the left, in the black. So it doesn't always work, right? But is it worthwhile? It's worked in the past, correct? And people, basically Jews throughout history, use that model of Jacob, of doing our best to use diplomacy to get what we want, even from somebody who's an avowed, so to speak, anti-Semite. So now, that makes a lot of sense. We established this, it's great. Actually, before we move on to the next piece, there's a very interesting idea here. We're saying that Jews can get what they want, get good things, even from those who dislike them or even hate them. So why is that? Why is that?
Well, because they give a compelling argument.
Okay, but if you hate me, why would you do something good for me?
Oh,
gonna get something
because I
from
want
it.
to get something from you.
Yeah.
So there's an article that this man wrote. He's a neuroscientist, and he wrote an analysis of the Mel Gibson story. Right? We all know what happened with Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
He was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history, right?
Yeah.
Big shot. He gets drunk one day and he's driving. He gets pulled over. The officer's name was something like Jack Mia or something. James Mee. The officer's name was James Mee. For whatever reason, James Mee. If I saw Officer Mee, I wouldn't ask the guy if he's Jewish. Mel Gibson somehow intuited this guy's Jewish. He asked the officer if he's Jewish. The man happened to be Jewish. James Mee.
Do you know why their star in California is six-pointed?
Oh, so okay. That's how he made that leap.
It wasn't the
Okay.
name.
You know, honestly, I always wondered about that because why would he assume this man was Jewish? So he asked the man if he's Jewish. He asked the arresting officer if he's Jewish, and he says no. Mel Gibson at this point was belligerent. He refused to go quietly. I think he even maybe physically assaulted the officer. I'm not really sure. Then he started ranting and raving about the Jews caused all the wars in the world,
And women.
and
Yeah,
a whole bunch of things.
Yes.
But between that and other instances in Mel Gibson's life, a lot of people decried him as anti-Semite.
Yeah.
So he probably not here, whatever. I don't know Mel Gibson very well personally, whatever.
Just look at the interview that Barbara Walters had with him and the way he tries to scare her. If looks could kill,
Right.
that was that interview.
He's a very intense man. We can't.
He
Very
was
intense.
just
man.
like,
More
you killed,
intense.
right. I never saw such, it frightened me watching the interview. Why is he boring? You
He's a
know?
nut. Yeah. Okay.
No, but this was all before, this predated the whole thing.
Right. So here we're going to read it. I think it's worthwhile reading it. I wasn't going to read it, but I think it's very interesting.
Mhm.
This analysis by this neuroscientist, a man by the name of David Eagleman. So he writes, brains are like representative democracies. I actually really like this analogy. Brains are like representative democracies, meaning what? They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There's an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. There's one output channel that a person has, their behavior, right? The way we act, the way we behave. But inside of us, there are many competing forces. The way he describes it is imagine a government, right? There's many different factions trying to get their voice heard to get the single outcome that they want. And he gives one example here. When the hostess at a party offers chocolate cake, you find yourselves on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forgo it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is, whether you put up your hand or not. As the French essayist Michel de Montaigne put it, I love this line, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. Right? Like Walt Whitman said, we contain multitudes. So this man's argument, which he makes in 8b, is that, is this the totality of Mel Gibson? I don't know, is basically his point. What he did was terrible, right? But is he totally total mishuganer that we have to write off? Maybe not, maybe yeah. But basically, we have an issue generally. I think this is something that applies to society broadly, not just in the context of anti-Semitism. We like to put people in categories, into neat boxes. Let's think about in the realm of anti-Semitism in particular. You have one circle of people that we like to say he's an anti-Semite. This one's a righteous Gentile. This one's against us. This one's for us. But the fact is that a human brain, the human psyche, is not monodimensional. There's a lot going on in a person. So to write somebody off completely and say this is the totality of that person doesn't make a lot of sense. Somebody can harbor many different things within them, right? So let's say Rabbi Shimon, let's go back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He could say it's an established fact that the Roman government hates the Jewish people. But at the same time, it might be well worth their time to entertain the possibility of not persecuting the Jews in this particular instance. So Yaakov knew that Esav wanted to kill him, but maybe it's not worth Esav's time if I can mollify him somehow. I could engage him diplomatically. We have a problem. Again, I think this is not just about anti-Semitism, it's about society in general, that it's either, everything's supposed to be black and white. You're either this or you're either that. You know, for instance, whenever somebody's accused of racism, what's their immediate response? I don't have a shred of racism, or I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't want to be too controversial, but if we're all being perfectly honest with ourselves, we all have inherent bias. That's just the way we are born. And we're hardwired based on where we grew up, the environment in which we grew up. Everyone has something with us. So to say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, that's not the point. Really what matters is your output, like the way he put it. You have one single mode of output, your actions. This actually sounds a lot like Tanya, if you think about it. Tanya tells us there's a lot going on with us, inside of us. There's a eternal struggle between the animal soul and the godly soul. But really all that matters is how you behave, or what your activity is like, right? So when it came to Jews throughout the ages dealing with those who hated them, most of them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, took the tack of recognizing that these people contain multitudes. People are complicated, right? There are shades of gray between black and white. So while, let's say, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire definitely was not a lover of the Jewish people, probably actively hated them, but still it's worth spending time and effort to deal with him diplomatically. So now, we established that throughout the ages, Jews found that it was worthwhile to go through the Yaakov route of using diplomacy first. But you could ask, and I think it's a pretty valid question, that our ancestors, especially Ashkenazi Jews of the past 1,000 years, they didn't really have a choice. What else were they supposed to do?
Always under defense.
Right? We said Yaakov had three options. He prepared in three ways. He prayed, he did diplomacy, he prepared for war. So the prayer, Jews always were able to do. The diplomacy, Jews always tried to do. But the war aspect, throughout most of our history, that was not an option. It was completely off the table. The Jews of the Holy Roman Empire decided we're going to stop an anti-Semitic decree by going to war. What would have happened?
Destroyed.
It would have been a disaster, right? You can't. The monarch had absolute, total authority. You couldn't use that option. We live in a very different world today. Today we have a voice. For the first time in the exile, we have a voice. So maybe it's worthwhile that when a guy like Pompidou comes and does something that seems to be, and actually was, in my opinion, targeted against Israel, that's going to harm Israel. So maybe, because we live in a very different world, we should make some noise. You know? Maybe we should use our mouths. Maybe we should write to our senators. Maybe we should march in the streets. Maybe we should do something about it.
And it was Perez who got the jets, wasn't it? That was it.
From Nixon?
No, Perez.
You're
got
saying in the
jets from
72.
French.
Originally, it was for 2 decades they got jets from the French.
Yeah, but I mean, I believe Perez had
From 48 until
Yeah.
about
Used to
70,
do it.
until 67
That's
was
right.
always from the French.
Yeah.
So we have the ability now, let's say, for instance, when a celebrity says something that we deem as anti-Semitic, we could do what most people like to do
On
today
Facebook.
and cancel them, right? Use the horde of internet users and just make them a sugar, right? Cancel them. We could hurt their reputations. We could destroy their livelihoods. We could do something about it. So now let's go to the Pompidou situation. What ended up happening in Pompidou? This is back to the New York Times. So the Jews at that time, let's just read the article. Text 9 on page 131. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by a state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police. I actually spoke to somebody, I think it was last year, who remembered being at these protests. He mentioned that he used to live in Chicago at the time, went to these protests, and they had a great time, right? So Pompidou was offended. Nixon had to fly out to mollify him, and right, that was what ended up happening. Because unlike our ancestors, we could go to war. Metaphorically speaking, we could go to war. So should we do so in this situation, right? So let's remember that Yaakov actually had the choice to go to war, but he chose the other route. So similarly, the Rebbe actually responded to this outcry. And let's see, I think it's interesting what the Rebbe has to say here. Text 10a on page 132. The public protest against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent, or at least reduce, French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country, that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective. Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. So this is what the Rebbe said at the time. And at the time, the Rebbe didn't explain what he meant that such agreements have been made in the past. But a year later, the Rebbe gave another talk, in which the Rebbe laid out exactly what he meant. Now we're reading 10b. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. He was willing to violate the embargo to help the state of Israel. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval of such sales were withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sale. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against exposing any of this, when we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them, "You're an anti-Semite, you're a thief, you're a murderer." Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings. So in this example, we have a straight up example of the long time approach of working behind the scenes working out. So I'm not saying that in every instance it's not right to protest. It's not that it's not appropriate to have a public outcry. We shouldn't let anti-Semitism, for example, just go unimpeded, and we should call it out. But the question is, what are we trying to accomplish when we do organize? We're trying to just use it as a way to make noise and to blow off some steam.
We're trying to show solidarity.
So we're doing solidarity.
Yes.
So for that instance, you don't have to yell at Mr. Pompidou.
Well,
We could say we could stand for the state of Israel. What am I trying to accomplish? Is the organizers of this march, are they trying to upset Mr. Pompidou, or are they trying to get the job done? Are they trying to show their solidarity with the land of Israel? Or are they going to shove his wife and himself around?
Mad just that they assembled. Because anti-Semites
Not necessarily
hate Jewish solidarity.
Oh, that's actually going to be the point later on.
Ask you a question?
Sure.
Why is it that BLM was just a nothing 8 years ago, and now has become a multi-million-dollar industry state? You tell me.
I'll tell you because what are they trying to accomplish, Shalom?
They're trying to bully people into fear.
So is that is that
afraid.
actually going to change anything?
Yeah, it is.
No, it doesn't change anything because they're worth $1 million, right?
Yes.
But what are they trying to do? They're trying to change officially. What's the ostensible cost?
Well, to change systemic
Right. What's officially the cost?
Racism.
Okay. So are they going to do it by making protests?
Yes, they're doing it.
How are they doing it? They're not
Well,
changing.
all of a sudden now we have low bail for people who can go and
Is that changing the problem?
drive through the parades.
Okay, is that changing the problem?
No, but they're getting power this way.
But again, are they solving the problem there
They're not
officially?
solving the problem.
Are they solving their problem, or are they just getting
They
themselves?
think they are.
I don't think they are either. Because if they wanted to, they would come to the table and try to deal with people, right? What was the reaction? I didn't want to talk about specific political movements in America today. That's why we use the Pompidou example, because it gets emotional when we talk about political things of today. But what was the conservative reaction to, let's say, the Black Lives Matter protest? What was the conservative reaction?
Well,
What was the reaction?
they
What happens when an animal is cornered
were
and you
cornered.
have no choice? No, what did they do? They fought back and they were entrenched in their positions, right? Again, I did not want to talk about modern political movements, but let's say taking down statues, right? So if they would have went against the statues against, let's say, Jackson or another one or two people who were like slave owners and they were bad people, what would have the reaction been? Okay, fine, I get it. We could talk about it. But if it's just we're going to tear everything down, what's the reaction? You can't take a single thing down, right? We're going to put a hard line in the sand and there's nothing to discuss because at this point, it's you against me and there's no more table. Forget about coming to the table to have a conversation. We destroyed the table, right?
And they're taking statues from the Capitol. They're winning.
Okay, I'm Shalom, but those are particulars. But what's actually changing? Are they changing the minds
The Capitol
of,
has
are
no
they
more
changing,
statues.
that's not accurate, but we're getting into particulars.
Yeah.
But are they changing anybody's mind?
But do they care?
I think,
they care about
do we
changing
want to change
lives?
people's minds?
I don't know.
No, I'm sorry, in our instance, we're talking about,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
right?
Jews want it.
Exactly.
I think that's an
So
old
I'm talking,
construct.
so,
They're saying that's an old construct
okay,
that doesn't seem to exist anymore. Now it's to deconstruct
It's
and then rebuild a new way. That's
Solinsky.
I'm sorry.
that,
Look,
Okay, but let's get back on track.
Jewish.
Let's get back on
All
track.
right.
What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to accomplish, for instance? When in an instance like Pompidou, what did we try to accomplish? Not to sell the
Saving the
planes to
state of
Libya, not to stay,
State-
right?
state of Israel.
And they were having conversations, and we could have gone about it that way, or it could have been belligerent,
Mhm.
and it wouldn't work out. Another example: do you remember, or people at home remember Jesse Helms?
Yes.
Before my day. So Jesse Helms was a very, very conservative, very religious man, and initially he was against everything having to do with the state of Israel, for religious reasons, for conservative ideology reasons, whatever. He actually even wanted to completely cut off any Israeli-American diplomatic ties after Israel invaded Lebanon in '82. He had a long track record of many years of being against everything that Israel stood for. And anytime aid was brought to the table, he voted no. And anytime, always voted no. Now, there was, when Reagan was president in '84, Reagan was president, he established that the Lubavitcher Rebbe's birthday should be known as Education Day USA, to honor the Rebbe and to recognize the fact that the Rebbe had a major push for education, not just for Jewish people, but for all Americans and for all people. And actually, it's one of the few things that all presidents do, no matter which side of the aisle they're from. Every year on the Rebbe's birthday, it becomes Education Day USA, till today.
Don't let too many people-
So Obama did it, Trump did it, Biden did it, Carter did it, everybody, not Carter, everyone did it, all right? So, and when this was first signed into, I don't know, it's not law, but when the proclamation was first signed, Chabad of Washington, D.C. made an event to celebrate. And among the people that were invited or who showed up were Jesse Helms. This point, he was a staunch opponent of the state of Israel, So a man by the name of Professor Alan Dershowitz, who you might have heard of,
Yeah.
and it doesn't really matter what you think about him today. Back in those days, today was a very staunch proponent of the land of Israel. At this
He
time,
still is.
yeah, no, I'm saying today, that was his.
Yeah.
So the rest of his politics really doesn't matter, right?
Mhm.
That's for you to decide. And he was a professor at Harvard at the time. Eventually, he actually became a faculty advisor to Chabad of Harvard. He had a better relationship with Chabad eventually. But at this time, he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I actually heard him say the story himself, and he said it was a very chutzpahdik letter. It was very sharp and not very respectful. Alan Dershowitz, for whatever you want to say about him, the man has a mouth on him, right?
Yeah,
He lets his opinions and his feelings be known to everyone. So he wrote a letter to the Rebbe. How could you let this Jew hater, Jesse Helms, be honored by Chabad, freaking out that a man like Jesse Helms would even walk over the threshold of Chabad? So the Rebbe responds to him and writes him a letter back. And then when the way Dershowitz tells the story, that he recognized that he crossed the line, but the Rebbe responded to him as follows. I trust you will agree that in regards to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, though I've never personally met this said person, Jesse Helms, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated, and this is something that's as true today as it was back in the 70s, are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it is no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it, it can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There's surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders, consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes. And when Dershowitz tells over the story, he gives a postscript, and he says, sure enough, very shortly after he was a guest at the Chabad dinner, Senator Helms got an influential role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and eventually became one of the strongest supporters of Israel in the Senate.
Oh, because of this invite?
No, we don't know, but it definitely didn't hurt, right? Definitely didn't hurt. You know what probably would have hurt? If the rabbi would have seen Jesse Helms say, "Two, Get out of here, you scumbag, right? The Rebbe's approach was,
Especially after you invited me.
That's why he's the Rebbe.
we gotta, does it hurt? Does it hurt? Does it hurt to extend an olive branch? Most of the time it's not. Is it always gonna work? That's not what we're saying. Yaakov also prepared for war. He did the diplomacy route, it worked out for him. But he was ready to back it up, right? What did the FDR say? Not FDR, Teddy Roosevelt. Walk soft and carry big sticks, right?
Yeah.
You have to have both. Do we want war? We don't want it. We don't need it. And like the Rebbe said, we don't have that many friends, so we shouldn't be going around making it more enemies.
Mhm.
Try to cultivate them. Is it always going to work? I guarantee you it's not always going to work. But is it going to hurt? Never. It doesn't hurt to try. So when we have a public figure, I'll give you, this is a very silly example. In the middle of the pandemic, there was a basketball player. His name was Myers Leonard. You think with a guy named like Myers Leonard, he might be Jewish. He was not. Big, huge white guy from like Indiana. There's like 6'11", big, huge guy, right? And he was playing video games once when he had a day off. And during the stream, nowadays, I'm sure your kids or your grandkids know about it, one of the biggest industries is people playing video games and people watching those people playing video games. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. $1 trillion industry. It's wild. Like, really. So he's he's streaming, as they say, and they're playing one of those violent games, and he gets out or he's killed, whatever it's called, and he calls the other guy a kike. Calls the other guy a kike. So now, slur, terrible slur. He should be called out for it. The reaction was everyone flipping out at this guy, losing it at him, cancel culture. I can almost promise you, the man had no idea what the word kike meant. Most people my age have no idea what it means, that it is even a Jewish slur. It's just, it means something negative.
Mhm.
Should he have used it? Probably not. It's very stupid of him to use it. But what would be more productive? Yelling at him online and canceling him and actually getting cut for the team, which ended up happening?
Wow.
Or inviting him to a synagogue, which also happened, and say, this is why it's hurtful and we need to educate yourself. Most hatred, the vast majority of hatred, at least in this country, is because of ignorance. Most bigotry is because of ignorance. Most of it. There are people who are real sickos, who deep down have a rot in their souls, who can't be helped. But most people, and I would even go so far as to say most people don't like Jews, it's because they've never met one, right? That whole thing, I've had friends who've gone talking about in the 2000s, who've met people and asked them, where are you hiding your horns, right? In the middle of nowhere, town, America.
And your tail.
Because they don't know anything, right? They don't know anything.
Yeah.
So here's another example that happened with me. I spent one Pesach in Romania, and I used the term, this guy tried to jip me, right? I didn't know what it meant. Right? There was somebody there of Romani descent, explained that it's a pejorative against the gypsy people. So what could,
wow.
because they used to steal. So he used to steal people. So when somebody gets ripped off, they say, he gypped me.
He gypped me down.
You gypped me, exactly. So
Wow.
most people have no idea what it means. So what's the better reaction? To call me a racist, to call this guy an anti-Semite, or to say what you did is ignorant. And here, let me lay it out to you. And here's how I can explain to you how you can be a better person and how the two of us can work together. When we just try to brush everyone with a broad brush and say, you are against me and you are my enemy, we're not going to get anything done. So let's say for us here in America, when somebody, let's say a singer posts something stupid online, this happens all the time, literally every single day. They say something dumb about Israel. So we could either freak out and start yelling and screaming at them, or we can call it out, say this is not okay. Here why not okay, and let's try to better educate ourselves and others, and try to make peace, right? A major problem. This is not just an anti-Semitic thing. This is an American problem now. Is that it's you or me, and we can't exist together. There's black and white, and we can't get together. Like the Home Depot paint mixers, right? You can't do that. We don't allow that to happen. So us as Jews, our first approach has to be at least giving a phone call. Can we come to the table and talk about this? There are people who don't like us, and even those people who don't like us, we could get what we need from them. Yaakov got it from Esav. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai got it from the Romans. Jews throughout history got it. The Rebbe got it with Jesse Holmes. Do we have to be prepared for the third option? Yeah. And thank God we're more prepared for that than we have ever been in our exile. We have a very powerful army in Israel, Baruch Hashem, protecting our interests over there. And we have a lot of influence here in this country. But we shouldn't immediately use that option. That's not the first option. It's the last option, right? Don't immediately flip up the red button switch and press that button.
The dots, you said they're 12 times in the Torah. The dots
Less than a dozen. I don't remember the exact number.
Okay. How many times were they used with that?
Over every letter.
I know, but I mean, with with Esau and Jacob? How many times were they used?
On that one word,
Yes.
all of those letters had the dots.
That's interesting because with learning Hebrew, to get a more clear understanding of it, I need the dots.
Oh, for sure.
And that cements it in, which makes that so important for everybody to understand how clear it is
Right.
to do that more so than something else.
Right.
You can't make a mistake.
I just want to say that where I agree is when kids used to do anti-Semitic, vandalizing and, just mischief.
Big stupid kids.
They would then, the court, make them learn about the Holocaust.
Right.
And they always choose that particular part of our history to try to teach these kids how bad it can get.
Right.
And maybe some of them became converted, but that's the only time I thought, well, this is a very good educating,
Right. So that's actually going to get us to our next point. No, we shouldn't make it defensive.
It seems
Education should not be defensive.
That's why.
We just mentioned the Education Day USA. Education is not supposed to be defensive.
Right.
Right.
No, but
Did ever wanted education?
going,
The point of we're supposed to be influencing everyone. Isaiah says the Jewish people are a light unto the nations. What does it mean, a light unto the nations? Our job. What are we chosen to be? What are we chosen to be? What does it mean, chosen people? We're supposed to be that light to show the guide the rest of the world. So it's our responsibility to be good. I'm sorry?
Now you're the canary.
That's both. Rabbi Jacobson says the same thing, right? The canary in the coal mine example. But we have a responsibility to try to help the rest of the world. By leading by example, that's one thing. That also helps in the world of anti-Semitism also. There might be somebody on your block or somebody at your work or even a relative who doesn't like Jews, right? But if you show them, but you're a good Jew, right? He's one of the good ones. Remember we said that joke, the difference between an anti-Semite and a Jew is an anti-Semite hates all Jews. What about your friend Goldberg? Goldberg, he's a shmigagi. Oh, no, Goldberg's one of the good ones. My accountant, he's a good one, right? You ask a Jew, ask an Orthodox Jew about the Jewish people. Oh, I love all the Jews. The Jews are great. Your accountant Goldberg, he's a thief, right? So if you go and you, first of all, we live a life based on our morals and our ethics, and we show the rest of the world who we are. That will change some people's mind. But on top of that, we have a responsibility to society to educate society at large. You mentioned the Education Day USA. The Rebbe was a very big proponent of educating everybody. We're gonna try to skip to the video. Just get to that.
Can't see it, Mindy.
Yeah, I'm getting to it, and then I'm gonna share the screen. Just give me 1 second. Oh, there we go.
It's terrible.
Okay, we're just gonna share it, and then we'll watch it together.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARC, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton. He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded. and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
שדור der חוק המדינה מדב gehen nach Beis Sefer, in der Beis Sefer miusod und durchgenommen. A was darf gern nach Beis Sefer darf gern Jidit. Linter darf Eisformen, Bufton, Bufmachen. A dem Jeser Leben Odom, als soll sein mit Midis Tevis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in den Besser Sefer. Aber der Riker lernen seine ist, was zum Ton Teva rumsieht. Und das ist der Thema mit Parsit. Und das ist im ganzen Niederei, in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Besefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novik, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they had extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The ARC project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. We have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular daily contributions and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly, actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities, and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
So you notice that on the table, and for those of you at home, we have these.
Good.
So take one of these home and also take an extra to give to at least one other person, right? To somebody else.
What about the poor people who don't have money to give.
You know what the
like for instance, let's say in Somalia,
right?
do they get one of these to make themselves
This
feel
actually,
good?
you know where this started? It started in South Africa.
Oh, forget South Africa. What about the person in Rwanda who doesn't even have feet?
We don't have.
They doesn't have food to feed their baby. Should we give them one of these so that they'll feel good about
We
themselves?
probably should, right? If we have the Chabad Shluchim there.
Take a better breast milk
So-
that he doesn't have in there.
So here in America, the American education system does two things very well.
What?
Teaches you how to sit in a desk for 7 hours straight and how to memorize dates, right? Dates and names. In 1492, the name, the not such a good, the Santa Maria, right? Great stuff, right? But so the Rebbe's argument was that education has to be, when you educate somebody, you're supposed to tell them how to be a mensch. We actually say in prayer, the first step to being a good person is to be a mensch. Teach people how to be a mensch, meaning a good person, a refined person, right? This is something that doesn't apply just to Jews, it applies to everybody.
Yeah.
This should happen through, for instance, literature. You read Silas
Is
Marner.
that
The
education?
teacher talks about
Yeah.
Godfrey Cass. Why was he such a, ne'er-do-well? I mean, so you learn to read Shakespeare.
That's
you
but
find
that's
out
that's a
Shylock
good
was-
teacher. That's a good teacher, right?
Yes.
Most teachers in the public school system, as long as they're got their the multiplication tables down,
That's
we
it.
could call it a day, right? Or they could, if they do Shakespeare and they read the Cliff Notes and they have no idea what it's actually trying to teach them, that's also good.
I taught. I would not think.
We're talking
in
about
my-
the system,
in-
though.
Wait.
Hmm.
I would be insulted if somebody said to me, "Teach them how to be mensches." You know what?
Why?
No, because I can't teach them how to be. I can try to
You
be a mensch.
are.
I can read them stories. Where in this book is the mensch and where's the bastard?
So does
You
that
know
not
what I
that
mean?
so you saw that as your mission,
Yes.
right? You
But
said
I'm not going to tell them
you
to go and
no,
collect
not that.
money.
No.
Yeah.
We're not there. The Rebbe actually had another project called the Moment of Silence.
Yeah.
Moment of silence was not to tell the kids to pray. Just take a moment to think about yourself, think about the world. If they go home and ask their parents what they should think about during this moment of silence, then they could teach them about their particular religion, their particular faith, how to daven to their God, so to speak. But it's not necessarily the school's place to tell them do X, Y, or Z. What he's encouraging them is that when you become a giving person,
Yeah.
it's not about how much you give. It's really not about how much you give. If you give a penny a day, or if you live in wherever you're giving a fraction of a penny a day, it's just the fact that you are someone who gives.
Yeah.
That changes your entire outlook, your entire mindset. So when we show that to the rest of the world, that's how you eliminate hate. Somebody when you're giving, right, for that penny, you're thinking about somebody besides for yourself,
Other than
even
yourself.
for a brief second, right? Even if it's costing you a penny or less, for a brief second, you're thinking about somebody else, and that can be life changing. It's a completely different viewpoint.
Well, we get to
That-
tobacco boxes.
no. No,
For-
100%.
yeah, for-
But it shouldn't just be for the Jew to support their synagogue or to
Right.
promote the trees in Israel. Every single person should be thinking about somebody else, empathy, right? Tzedakah is really all about empathy. That I recognize there's somebody else who is lacking, and I have, so I want to help them out, right?
Yes.
So before we wrap the whole thing up, the entire course, I just want to give basically some of the takeaways about the entire course in general. So in the first lesson, we talked about we always have to stay calm and be trusting in Hashem, but at the same time, we have to come up with plans, practical plans, how to do it, creating that vessel. Remember that vessel analogy? That way Hashem can help us, so to speak, through that vessel. We should never internalize anti-Semitism and blame it upon ourselves, which is a major issue for Jews of today. We have to be open about our Jewish identity, define anti-Semitism, to show that we're proud of it, proud of who we are, proud of our traditions, proud of our practices, our heritage. We should also share the awareness of Hashem's mission, of God's mission for all mankind, and not just for ourselves. That helps other people help fill up that inner void. Remember, we talked about Haman and his inner void. We show them purpose. That helps with that. We also thank God for the gift of the land of Israel and do everything we can to keep it safe and to keep it prosperous. And finally, it's recognizing that it's not necessarily always in our best interest to immediately start publicly shaming and accusing, but we should try to at least be diplomatic just to start, right? If we need, again, do what Jacob did. If we need to bust out the big stick, like Teddy Roosevelt talked about, then we'll do that too. But one last point I want to make. Before we start dealing with the Jew hater out there in the world, I think it's very important that first of all, we have Jewish unity.
Yes.
And what I mean by this is something very interesting we find in going back to the Purim story for the last time. The Purim story, when Haman goes to Ahasuerus the king to talk to him about annihilating the Jewish people, he opens up his argument. His entire argument about destroying the Jewish people starts off with, Yeshnoi am echad mefuzar u'mefored bein b'chol midinas medinas malchusecha. There's one nation in your empire that's spread out and thin, spread out thinly and dispersed, scattered and dispersed throughout all the countries of your empire. So what's the vice? What's the problem? Like, why should the king care if they're spread out? I don't have to go find them. Why is that a vice? Why is that a reason to destroy them? So what Haman was saying is that what he's arguing is that you don't have to worry about the Jews overcoming your plot to annihilate them. And I'll tell you why. They're all scattered and they're separate and they're disparate. They're not standing together. One of the things I do with my bar mitzvah students, actually, when I teach them about how important unity is and solidarity is, I bring a stack of computer paper, right? A stack of computer paper, like 40 papers high. I tell them to rip a paper. So they take a paper, they rip it. They take another paper, rip it. Is it hard? No. I'll take 20 pages and try ripping it. Take 30 pages and try ripping it. Take 40. There's a reason why when a bunch of guys want to show off, they rip phone books, because it's really, really hard to do. Why? Is the paper stronger? Yes, because it's with other papers, right? So when the Jewish people, when we have solidarity and we have each other's backs, then we are more strong. Then we're stronger. Even in the animal world, right? Safety in numbers. Mm-hmm. So the first step, and I think the most vital step that we can take, is to have Jewish unity. And interestingly, Esther, when Esther starts her plan to save the Jewish people, you know what's the first thing she told Mordechai? Go and gather the Jews. Even before we do the prayer, and even before we do the fasting, and even before we go ahead and start making plans how to thwart Haman's evil plan, the first step is gathering together and recognizing our unity. So we want to fight anti-Semitism in whatever forms it faces. We face today. The first step is to think about another Jew that you don't necessarily agree with, and maybe even actively disagree with them. Maybe actively disagree with them, whether it's in matters of theology, matters of God, Jewish practice, Israel, politics here in the States, whatever it might be. And the first step is to have unity with somebody like that. And we can all resolve to do that both within our own communities, the broader Staten Island community, which is just something we could all work on, right? Everyone's operating you have the Reform doing their own thing, the Orthodox doing their own thing, the Hasidim doing their own thing. Maybe we can all share some matzo ball soup together, right? Why are we all doing our own thing? The first step to fighting anti-Semitism is to be strong together. And when we're strong together, that itself is a defense of anti-Semitism. If Haman saw Jewish unity at that time, he wouldn't even start up with the Jewish people, is this argument of this interpretation. One of we say every single day in prayer, the end of the Amidah prayer, every single day, at least 3 times a day, God bless us because we are all united. The very last line in the entire Talmud, the entire Mishnah, is that God could not find a greater vessel for blessing for the Jewish people than shalom, than peace. Imagine peace is a big basket, so you could pour the blessings into it. If that's shalom, and it will hold, the blessing will hold within that basket. If that basket is fractured, the blessing will seep away. The first thing we need to establish as a Jewish people is to remember that we're a community. We are one people. And that is the first step. And if we do that, God willing, everything else will deal with in its own time. That has to be the first step. Couple programming notes before we open up for further discussion. This upcoming Sunday is going to be the public menorah lighting at the mall. This is a great example of showing how we're all united and we're all one community. The public menorah lighting is one of the few instances where you will see a Chassidish guy with the payas and a Jew who doesn't wear a yarmulke, right? Or a woman wearing shorts with a woman wearing the fancy, right, the wigs, the shavings. At Hanukkah, I think it's a great time to do that. And we're showing it, we're not doing it in a shul, right? We're not doing it in a temple. We're doing it out in the mall for the world to see. That we are one community and we stand together. We have solidarity. So next Sunday, 4:30 at the Staten Island Mall, outside of Barnes & Noble's. If you know where the Shake Shack is, it's outside the Shake Shack, 4:30.
Sunday. I'm going to go to Remy's.
And it is of vital importance that we show all the Jews of Staten Island and the broader Staten Island that we are united and we have solidarity for one another. In addition to that, on Tuesday of Hanukkah, so that would be the 30th, we're having that concert at the Young Israel, the Betty Friedman concert. It's going to be a good show. Tickets are going fast, so if you want to, then you should go to the website and buy the ticket. We are going to be having another JLI course in about 2 months, in February. The title is Meditation from Sinai, but the idea of the course is that there's a lot of Jewish mysticism out there, a lot of Jewish spirituality out there. How do we actually make it something practical? How do we actually have it affect our lives? There's also this idea in Eastern religions of meditation, right? Back in the 70s, Jews were going crazy for meditation. You had all these Jews going to other religions for their meditation. There's Jewish meditation. How do we do that, right? How do we take the wisdom of Sinai and apply it within our own hearts and our own minds, even using the tools of meditation? So that's going to be in a couple of weeks. Look out for the emails, the brochures, etc. So thank you all for joining me for this course. I hope you enjoyed it at least as partly as much as I did. And now we're going to open the floor to everyone to join. I'm going to end the recording so you don't have to worry about, I don't know, somebody find this.